The views and opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of Acuma, its board of directors, its management staff, or its members. The podcast discussion presented is conversational in nature and for general information only.
Hello and welcome to Acuma's On Point Podcast, a policy series where we focus on policy issues impacting the credit union mortgage industry. I'm your host, Peter Benjamin. Today's episode is being brought to you by LenderPrice, the most modern and proven product and pricing engine in lending. Whether it's enhancing the pricing experience or efficiently matching home buyers with the ideal loan program, LenderPrice empowers all credit unions to excel and innovate in today's dynamic market. Their cost-effective pricing engine provides modern APIs that deliver seamless integrations, full product and rate support, custom workflows, and it's simple and easy to use for loan originators. LenderPrice is proud to sponsor the Acuma On Point Podcast policy series, where discussions on the policy issues impacting credit union mortgage lenders take center stage. Get to know LenderPrice and book a demo at www.lenderprice.com. Joining us today is, as our resident expert, is Leah Dempsey, shareholder, and Anne-Marie Comboy de Pasquale, policy advisor with Brownstein. Leah, Am, this is your first time on the pod, so welcome. But how are you both doing today? Just out of curiosity, how are y'all both doing?
We're doing pretty well. Excited to be here for the first time. Thank you. Thanks again for having me.
Actually, I kind of fumbled that start, so I don't want to fumble the start anymore. Now, so a couple weeks back, actually last week, we were in Denver, and when I came back, obviously I didn't check my emails much because we were at our Focal Point workshop in Denver, which both of you attended. And when I came back, it seemed like I came back to a full inbox. This inbox was full with like a lot of updates from just things happening in DC. So it seems like once again, DC is rocking and rolling, whether they're trying to just push stuff forward before another vacation, another recess. So I guess to that point, I feel like there's a lot of things that I need to catch up on, a lot of things that our listeners need to catch up on. So if you, it doesn't matter who starts, whether it's Leah or Anne-Marie, do me a favor, kind of catch us up on things happening in DC.
I guess I can jump in to start and feel free to jump in, Emery, whenever makes sense. But thanks again for having us on the podcast.
Of course.
We wanted to first give a little bit of a preview for a really important event happening in July when Emery and I are taking to the basketball court against several members of Congress. And many of them actually are on the Financial Services Committee, so are people that are impacting mortgage issues, and we'll be discussing some of these issues and more on the basketball court if we survive that night and don't break our legs or dislocate our arms or anything like that. So
for those that you don't know, Anne-Marie is the Caitlin Clark of Brownstein. She is a sure thing from the 3-point line. So it should be a fun thing to watch. So if you're in the DC area and you want to watch a surefire 3-point shooter, come watch Anne-Marie light up some senators and representatives.
And for those of you who are not in the DC area, the game is not televised, so you'll just have to rely on our accounting of my 3-point abilities.
That's right. So Leah, please continue.
But speaking of medical injuries, last week we saw a new proposal come out of the CFPB related to medical debt. And it talks about that it's going to limit the ability to use information on credit reports if a consumer owes medical debt. And I think, at first glance, that's something that sounds good to all of us. Everyone is sympathetic to people with medical emergencies. Of course, there's unplanned debt associated with medical care. But, a deeper dive into this rule, I think, presents some potential challenges for mortgage providers. There are several, different components to it related to how you would be using medical information going forward. one interesting thing is that it talks about the fact that if a consumer does provide information on an application about their owed medical bills, that is still as part of the ability to repay requirements under TILA and Reg Z, still something that the credit union should be considering. It's a little bit unclear at this point whether they're saying it needs to be considered or it could be considered. But my reading of it is it's a little bit ambiguous, which is never a good thing. Whenever there's ambiguity, that's when there's litigation and when there's compliance uncertainty. So that's one thing that we're taking a closer look at to see how this impacts those complying with TILA and Reg Z. And then in general, just how it impacts underwriting, and if people do owe, thousands and thousands of dollars in medical debt, how does that impact other decisions that are being made for their mortgages, their car loans? And is it really a good thing for those consumers if they're getting, a mortgage that they can't actually afford? So all of that will be, I think, the subject of many comments that are going to be filed over the next 2 months. The comment period's open until April, but it is something we think the administration and the CFPB are going to move quickly on. It's a popular election talking point to be forgiving different types of debt. And we think we could even see a final rule on this maybe before the election.
Right. So the CFPB came out and said, okay, they are considering removing medical debt from the credit reports, right? And so, but in your reading of the possible rule, right, just thinking about, the ability to repay, would there be any type of safe harbor under that rule whatsoever for the lender?
Yeah. And so that's what it's a little bit unclear, because essentially what the CFPB seems to be saying is that they like their previous rules in this area. They like that you have to consider all these things in the ATR analysis, but now you just can't use a credit report. But if a consumer provides medical information, you can use that. And I just personally, the lawyer in me sees all sorts of potential problems there. Even issues like claims of redlining. If a certain area that a certain credit union is getting a lot of information about medical bills and another credit union isn't because they have a different process, are the statistics on that going to look like there's redlining? To me, it just, I think, opens a whole host of probably unintended consequences that people are not thinking about. But when you start to introduce these situations where, sometimes you consider the debt, sometimes you don't, sometimes you consider it on the credit report, you don't consider other types of debt, it just gets extremely complicated, and it really starts to water down the value of, the credit report in general. Right.
I mean, even just, thinking back to my time as a lender, the number of times that, I remember just a borrower in general, and I know credit unions are members, but I'm going to say in general, a borrower came to me and wanted to do a refinance or even a home equity line of credit to actually pay off some form of medical debt, because, medical debt can get, quite large. The only way you're able to do that and even validate that is actually see it on credit report. And oftentimes, right. And so if it's not on the credit report, how do you even validate the actual amount? So it's fascinating, right? I know the NBA is kind of pushing back on it. There's some hesitation on their side, but from the sound of your voice, there seems to be a little hesitation from your side as well. Interesting to see how this unfolds. All right. So what else is next? What else is on your list of things to cover from both of you?
You want to stick with the CFPB?
Well, we'll go with the noobs. What's up, noobs? All right, Anne.
I'm noobs.
Yeah, you're noobs.
All right. Well, I think we'll stick with the CFPB just for now before we segue into the broader universe of what's going on in Congress and DC. But those of you who were in Denver heard Leah and Zach talk about the new RFI from the CFPB on closing costs.
Yep. And quick plug on Denver. We also had Mark McCardle, who did cover this as well. But I will say Zach and Leah did an excellent job covering this segment, gave us an excellent primer for Mark McCardle to come in. So Anne-Marie, please continue.
Great. Yeah. I think that's one of the best things about the setup of Acuma events, just as another plug, is that you get to have all of these different angles and viewpoints come in So if you haven't been to an event yet, definitely would recommend you get to one. But the closing costs RFI, I don't want to relitigate too much what Zach and Leah talked about, but it is another example of the CFPB being emboldened post the Supreme Court decision that we've talked about before, and really pushing forward with its agenda and trying to get as many things out there as possible. The RFIs, we've talked before on this podcast about them being a precursor to future rulemaking. So the RFI really is the first step in the rulemaking process. They're going to try and gather information on a host of different questions that were put out. They'll kind of absorb that information and try and get a rulemaking out potentially before the end of the year. Another thing we've talked about before is, with the uncertainty in the presidential race, that the Biden administration will try and move as many rules as possible before we get into that risk area of December, January, and the uncertainty around what 2025 will look like.
Is there any possibility that, all right, so, the junk fees, like how far extreme does this thing go? Like in your, Anne-Marie, in your opinion, what, Leah's opinion, how far does this go? I mean, there's common sense approach to this, right? It obviously seems like they're targeting credit reports, right? Mm-hmm. And the common sense approach to this is very much like us as lenders, us as credit unions, and I'm going to say banks for the most part. The large, we have no control over this, right? And in turn, we very much, because we have no control over this, we have no control over what the consumer pays when it comes to that type of thing, right? But how far does this thing go? How far does the CFPB take this junk fee thing? If I remember correctly, Mark McArdle even kind of hinted at, like, does the CFPB kind of even propose going down the path of just one fee for everything, like one fee to rule them all? Like, is that the answer to this? Is that where they're going with this?
I think there is a concerning tendency to paint fees very broadly as junk fees, but when everything is a junk fee, nothing is a junk fee. And to your point, Peter, there are fees that can be controlled and fees that serve a real purpose in the marketplace. You're seeing, junk fees are a popular talking point on both sides of the campaign trail and both sides of Washington, but there is more hesitancy certainly on the Republican side to say, we shouldn't be painting everything with the same pen. There should be delineations here. There should be caution in what we're labeling a junk fee and what we're not. The FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, has a much broader rulemaking in process regarding junk fees. I don't see the CFPB going anywhere near as broad as the FTC has, but I think, and I'll certainly defer to Leah and her legal analysis, but they're going to try and, I think, push on as many fronts as possible, particularly over the next couple months as you see a lot of gridlock in Congress. And like I said, junk fees continuing to be a popular talking point as lawmakers are back home in their districts.
Not to make this, not to segue this to an election conversation. And I'm most certainly not watching, I'm not watching when Biden, goes and he kind of, talks. I'm not watching when Trump goes and he kind of gives his speeches. I do my best to kind of catch up on whatever article that is put out. But when they go and they kind of talk to their constituents, are they even bringing up junk fees? Like, is this even talking points for them?
So this is actually a very popular talking point. People like free stuff, and when we talk about fees, it sounds good to call them junk and to potentially not have them anymore. But some of these fees are time tested parts of the financial services system that have disclosures. They've been around for a long time. I think one good example from this RFI is the credit pulls. Pulling your FICO score or something like that. It may sound like a pain in the neck and an extra fee, but I'm sure many people in 2008 and 2007 that were getting homes that they really couldn't afford, that led to their financial ruin when homes went under and there was the Great Recession. I bet they would have appreciated the fact if a credit report gave some indication to their lender that they couldn't actually afford that loan and shouldn't have maybe been getting into that process. I mean, those are what some of these types of fees are doing and why they're out there. And they, in my opinion, mixing them up with politics to win a talking point or to win a tweet, it really starts to derail consumer protection and can be really problematic.
Yeah, but I agree with that, right? So like what a credit report shows a borrower's willingness, right? Historical willingness to repay. When you look at 2007, 2008, that's the absence of the borrower's ability was what's in my mind, what's really caused it, right? The lack of documentation of income, assets, etc. That's all there. We're not repeating the mistakes of the past, and I don't think we ever will. This seems, oftentimes, once again, we have nothing else to complain about, or we have nothing else there's no other witch hunt to go down. So let's just find something else to complain about. I don't know. Maybe I'm just making a mountain out of a molehill. Again, was something that started off as something that was a credit card thing, and all of a sudden it morphed into a mortgage thing. So, all right. So I'll move on. I don't know if I say shut up, whether that makes this an explicit thing, but I'm going to say it anyways. Sorry, Justin. I'll repent later. But so what else is on the list? Sorry. So we talked about, medical debt. We talked about junk fees. What else should we be paying attention to in DC?
I will do I don't think we can get through a podcast without mentioning Peter's favorite topic, artificial intelligence.
Yes.
So I will just quickly say that, keeping with the RFI trend, the Treasury Department put out a request for information on artificial intelligence. It's pretty broad. There are 19 questions that they're asking interested folks to respond to. They go through a bunch of different topics, from data confidentiality to a whole range of third-party risks to illicit finance, fraud, potential discrimination, other issues that are cropping up when you're dealing with consumers and their information. But the final question in the RFI focuses primarily on jurisdictional issues. So it recognizes that we're seeing this rise of regulatory approaches to AI, both abroad and now at the state level in the United States. Colorado recently became the first state to put out a regulatory regime for artificial intelligence. California is trying to follow behind it. So Treasury, in closing its RFI, acknowledged that, there are these mounting pressures that will only continue to get worse with the rise of potentially conflicting, I should say, approaches to how AI is regulated. And they're certainly going to do the best that they can to get ahead of that, the patchwork effect that creates. But as we've talked about previously, Congress is going to move very slowly on this issue. It's going to be a drip of progress, not a river. So this is just the latest step in that, the effort of the agencies to do what they can in the face of slow movement on the congressional front.
Okay. Love it. I love it. So, and you're right. It is one of my favorite topics, ever changing, ever evolving. Again, I just did my update to our ChatGPT. So it's exciting times. It's exciting times. Okay. Let's go through one more topic. What's one more thing that we should be paying attention to?
I guess just one thing, because it's going to be extremely timely this week or next week, is we're waiting for this big Supreme Court decision on Chevron. And, why is this relevant to credit unions working in the mortgage area? It really could change the whole scope of how rulemaking is done at agencies, depending on how the court rules. Essentially, ever since the Chevron deference was put into place in the 80s, actually by Justice Scalia, which is interesting because it's really something that people might say has emboldened, administrative agencies to do a lot more, what some people would say closer to legislating that Congress should be doing, and kind of a separation of powers issues that you wouldn't necessarily attribute to Scalia. A textualist and probably didn't support some of the ways that eventually Chevron went. But right now, because of Chevron, agencies have a lot of deference to interpret statutes and put out rulemakings. This is what we're seeing on things like the medical debt. They're a broad interpretation of the FCRA. If that is struck down in the Chevron case, they may have to more closely stick to what the statute itself says. So, for instance, in Dodd-Frank, there were some very specific mortgage rules that the Bureau was told to do. That would probably still be fine because Congress specifically told them to do it. But all these other mortgage rules, things like the most recent RFI and, the Fair Credit Reporting Act rulemaking that's underway. Those are not things that Congress gave any directive on. So depending on, how wide reaching this decision is, it could impact all of that. It could also impact how Congress acts as well, because right now, a lot of times Congress will kick things to the agencies. Their law will include something like directing the CFPB to do a rulemaking. Again, like we saw in Dodd-Frank, if Chevron, requires them to be more prescriptive in their lawmaking, they may have to very specifically talk about some of these issues like, TRID and HMDA and things that we don't normally see Congress getting involved in. So that's I think a big one, and we're on the lookout. Supreme Court is wrapping up their session by the end of the month, and it should be out very soon.
Do you foresee like anything being rolled back, or just kind of just prevent any changes going forward?
So it really depends on how the court writes their decision, because they could, in their decision, completely blow up the Chevron doctrine, which is a two-part test that looks at whether Congress has spoken on the issue, and if they have spoken, whether the interpretation is reasonable, which is the second part. If that whole thing gets blown up, it could really limit the agencies and what they're doing a lot. The Supreme Court could take a less intrusive route by only slightly modifying the two-prong test, or finding, a very narrow decision just specifically about the facts of the case. In this particular instance, it's about a phishing case, so nothing really in financial services world. We just don't know until we see the decision, but we kind of suspect, based on the oral arguments and based on some of the questions from the more conservative justices, that they're going to do something closer to blowing it up, which really is going to change a lot of how DC operates right now.
Okay. We have about a minute or two left. In the last minute or two, any quick updates on the election? And I know I often ask you this, and I pretty much ask you that on every episode of our policy series. But of course, it's that time of year, right? The election's right around the corner. Any updates on the election?
Well, the first presidential debate of this election is next Thursday, the 27th. So don't forget to tune in, folks. I think it'll be pretty informative. It'll be interesting to see the two candidates up there together. It's being put on outside of the usual format of presidential debates. It's being put on directly by the networks. So it'll also be interesting to see.
There's no audience, right?
I have to look at the rules again. I think they were haggling over a bunch of specifics about, how long people could stand or not stand. Some rules about the microphones being on and off at certain points in time. So it's going to be quite the production.
Okay.
Yeah, I think there was no audience. It's definitely an interesting election, and we see a new twist every week. We see something in the litigation against Donald Trump. Some of the other family challenges the Biden family is facing, and it's just we've never seen anything like this before. So it's hard to make predictions at this point about what might happen next.
Close to a soap opera than anything else, right? The whole thing.
Definitely.
Okay. Well, Leah, Anne-Marie, thank you very much for joining us on the latest episode of the ACMA's On Point podcast, the policy series. I really do appreciate it. Both of you truly do appreciate it. It's been great. Again, thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Of course.
Thank you so much.
Thank you again to Lender Price for sponsoring our policy series. And to all of you, we know your time is valuable. Thank you for tuning into the latest episode of ACMA's On Point podcast. We hope you enjoyed it. Until next time, bye for now.
Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time at the ACUMA On Point podcast. If not already, be sure to subscribe and give us a 5-star rating. For more great episodes and information, be sure to visit us online at acuma.org. And to get the latest updates, head over to our LinkedIn page.